job on the...
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to The Collective. We have another fantastic show for you planned out today. Very excited. We got the return of Clay and Craig. Very stoked. Now, while I am stoked for that, y'all should be stoked too. Make sure you're liking the show. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell. Do all that good stuff. Get your emails in the morning or the afternoon or whichever day we go live, which is, of course, every day. Now, if you have any thoughts, questions, comments, anything at all, by all means, put them up in the comment section, kind of like this one, so we can engage them right away. Salty Jinx, afternoon all. Hope it's been an amazing week. I've had an amazing week. Have you guys had an amazing week?
Yeah.
Groovy. Daniel's also here. Good morning, afternoon, gents and the collective family. Vanessa Chaos, good day, everyone. Good to see y'all. So today, we're going to be getting into courage in the face of the enemy. But before we do that, let's do some intros. Clay, how about you? 10 to 15 seconds. Who are you? Where you come from? That good stuff.
Okay, yeah, so I actually live in Southwest Virginia, United States. I'm an Army infantry veteran, both Iraq, Afghanistan. And funny enough, having had been on here a few times, I remember talking about how I used to be a substance abuse counselor, but in order to get in the game, I actually went back to doing that part-time because of you guys, just to help others. So currently back into the substance abuse counseling realm. I'm a BJJ practitioner, head kickboxing coach at the Henzo Gracie Academy in Blacksburg, and that's me in a nutshell.
Bam, I like it, buddy. Outstanding. Craig, how about yourself?
Former Navy SWIC, boat guy. I did some private military work doing motorcades and like protective security details in Iraq for the State Department. And now I have a co-own a coaching company called Building the Elite, where we train special operators or people going into special operations courses.
Bam. I like it. And no big deal. As Shaun was saying right as we went live, we had your cohort there, John, on a little while ago. Another fantastic podcast, great conversation with him. Although Shaun likes to chat right as I'm like, everybody good? Everybody good? Everyone's good? Okay, we're all good. I'm going to hit live. And then he has to jump in. So I just love how he does it. It's fantastic. So let's get into the topic then. Courage in the face of the enemy. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, here we go. Courage in the face of the enemy refers to the ability to confront and overcome fear or danger when confronted by an adversary or opponent. It is a concept often associated with bravery and valor in the context of a conflict or war. This phrase suggests that individuals are displaying courage despite being in a situation where they are directly opposed or threatened by an enemy force. Courage in the face of the enemy is not limited to military situations. It can also be applied more broadly to any challenging or intimidating circumstances where individuals must summon inner strength to confront and overcome adversity. It speaks to the resilience and determination of individuals to stand firm and face challenges even when confronted by formidable opposition or danger. So with that said, let's get some first
We should
thoughts
have
in
a
here.
podcast just for the definition. Could we...
Yeah.
Sure. Let's get some first thoughts on it. What do we got? Clay, what are your first thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it could go so many different ways, fear. There are practices out in the world that believe that fear is one of the four major intentions that a person has. So fear, duty, desire, and love would be the four. But it could be external, it could be internal, and it could be, as Shaun was kind of alluding to, and I'm actually kind of interested to see where he goes with it. It could be in the form of artificial intelligence. So fear is another one of those really complex topics that could go a lot of ways.
Absolutely. Craig, first thoughts?
Well, I'm kind of using something Shaun said before we started recording, that some of that is going to be self-referential. It might have been what you said, Chance, that face of the enemy is probably something that comes from within, like what you're doing in your head during extremely difficult moments. And this morning I was writing our like Instagram posts, the social media stuff that we're going to put out next week, and those are all for us just based on usually client conversations. And I've been working with clients lately on how they handle that peak moment of like, say you're in buds and you're doing boats and logs, or you're in some terrible beatdown thing, like or if you're a jiu-jitsu competitor, you felt this yourself, or you feel it in your opponent, where there's this peak moment where you're just exhausted. And there's kind of two ways to go about it. Either you can tell yourself that you can't really handle this, you're just going to try to get through it and survive it and it'll be okay when it's over, or you find a way to make it okay in that moment. Like you find a way to like be there in that moment and fight the fight you're in while you're there, without running away from it or numbing yourself to it or becoming passive. And I've been toying with that concept because I think that's kind of like where we practice this skill of facing the enemy in the most like common, realistic way in a hard workout, in a jiu-jitsu competition. If you're in selection, it's what you're doing in the worst parts of your day where you're going to have to confront your own thoughts and your own sense of self while you're suffering, in a point where you think you might break. And I'm interested in what happens in people's minds in those moments.
Absolutely. Shaun, what are your first thoughts on this?
Yeah, like Craig, I'm interested in that moment as well, when courage actually has to be applied. Because in the face of the enemy, if we strip out the word courage, in the face of the enemy, lots of people have lots of plans, and they'll consider what they're going to do through a romanticized notion by watching several Hollywood movies. They'll figure out, this is what I'm going to do. But having the courage to do it in the moment is the trick. And I think that courage is something that is built over time, that you can develop a resume of courage, for lack of a better term. Now, I'm not excluding everyone out there who's never been courageous. If you've never been courageous in your entire life, as a thought experiment, for sure you can be courageous today through some sort of epic event that causes you to have to engage in a courageous moment. But if you haven't done a whole lot of courageous things in your life, chances are that courage isn't something that you call on the regular. And I think it's kind of like a skill set. The more courageous you are, the easier it is to be courageous in all of the moments that are directly in front of your nose throughout the month, throughout the week, throughout the day. And so courage is the real key to me in this title. And of course, by being courageous within yourself or facing yourself on the daily, that's actually what allows you to establish what the enemy is. And so if you're not doing any internal work, if you're not courageous against the things that bubble up inside of you, if you just kind of ignore all of the red flags that are popping off, or all the red lights on the engine dashboard that are popping off inside of you, you don't have the courage to face that. Well, I would guess, I would propose actually, that the enemies that you're facing externally probably don't have to even be there, probably are manufactured to some degree simply because you don't have the courage, or you haven't had the courage to kind of tamp down or deal with some of these internal conflicts that you've got, and you're externalizing your internal problems to some degree, therefore creating false enemies, as it were.
Ooh, that is interesting. Let's go around again on that. Clay, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I kind of like where Shaun's going with it, because courage as a practice it's interesting, because you don't. I think a lot of the times when we talk about fear, we talk about it in a way of if we can remove fear, if we can remove the negative emotion or feeling of fear, then somehow we win. But I don't really think it works that way. I think it's more along the lines of what Shaun's kind of hinting at, is you don't remove fear, and fear doesn't necessarily go away. You just become braver. You just practice on building courage. You have moments or experiences where you faced fear, you overcame it, and on the other side of that unknown moment is you as a better person. And if you can compound on that experience and internalize it, then you're practicing, we could call it the art of courage. So I kind of like that aspect of it. That was my initial thoughts.
I like that. Craig, any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's a good take. Like courage is not the absence of fear. Like you cannot have courage without fear. Otherwise, you're just doing a thing. You might be unaware, like caught off guard, something like that. But courage is impossible without the presence of fear. When I was a kid, I read this book called The Quality of Courage by Mickey Mantle, like the baseball player. It's basically a kid's book, or it's meant for like young adults to teach that as a value. And I remember one of the stories of it was a guy where they had a gas lantern, a gas lamp, and someone had bumped it off of a table. The guy saw it as it was falling and caught it in his hand and then placed it back on the table and burnt the crap out of his hand in the process because the glass thing is super hot from the thing. And they used that as an example of courage, and like he had to hold this incredibly painful thing and calmly put it back in place in order to not drop it, because if he dropped it, it would explode fire and fuel across the floor and set the entire house on fire. So that courage is not possible without the in the moment pain that he was accepting and acknowledging and dealing with anyway. Like grabbing a cold thing and putting it on the table wouldn't matter. It's the fact that it hurt so much that it damaged his hands that made it an act of courage.
Interesting, Shaun. Back to you. What are you thinking?
Yeah, that is interesting. That how our childhood or our teenage years can kind of establish what courage means to us, and whether we see it in 3D or whether we read it in a book or whether we see it in a movie or a TV series. I think a lot of things can establish what courage means or facing fear means. And so Craig gave that example, and immediately the example that popped into my mind, and I don't know if you guys watched the series, it was back in the day, and it was Kung Fu with David Carradine, Chance Burles. And he would wander North America, mostly the U.S., wander the U.S. as a quasi, it's supposed to be an Asian guy, but it was David Carradine. And he was supposed to be like a Shaolin monk kind of character where he was wandering through the U.S. and saving the damsel in distress and kicking the bad guy's ass and doing all of the right things and none of the wrong things. And so before he went to America, when he was back with his sensei, we'll call it, what he had to do was pick up a heated up rock. And so he picked it up, and the mark imprinted on each forearm sizzled into his skin, and he had to hold it there and get his branding. And then presto changeo, he's David Carradine out there kicking ass. And so I'd watch that entry into each show, into each episode. And when he'd be holding that, I'd be like, wow, that is unbelievable. My young mind just looked at that and thought, I didn't call it courage, but that's what I was seeing. I just had a different title for it. But the courage in the moment to absorb the pain, the suffering, the hardship, for lack of a better term, that really stood out to me, because at that time on TV, there were no real moments like that. A lot of it was, 6 shooters and pow, pow, pow. And, guys were fake falling down, and it was so comical. There was nothing really gritty, kind of real with it. Even the good, the bad, and the ugly. When someone got shot, it wasn't like gritty. But for some reason, Kwai Chan Kane picking up that and getting sizzled, it felt gritty. And that to me was the first time that I kind of established that idea of that's kind of what courage looks like. So, I think each individual, and this is Craig's thoughts that made me kind of consider this. Each individual, as we are brought up in our childhood or teenage years, or who's surrounding us as young people, kind of start establishing what courage is. And if you lived in a wild family, your idea of courage is different than the neighbor down the street who didn't live in a wild family. And so, courage in the face of the enemy, I think, is probably different for the 4 of us than it is for 4 of our neighbors who have never lived the lives that we've lived. So maybe we could talk about contextuality before we dive straight into the face of the enemy kind of thing.
Absolutely. That was where I was going to go with this question, actually, was the fact that, do you believe that courage is only seen as courageous based on our previous experience. So, to your point with the burning of the arms, even as young children, we know what it feels like to be burnt. Usually, especially back in the day. I don't know about now. My kids have very little experience with being burnt, but they understand the pain, right? As a kid, I understood what it felt like to have skin burn deeply. So there's a recognition of, the pain that that's going to cause. And you can recognize that he's making a physical choice to do that ahead of time. It's not like it's just like thrown on him and he's reacting and catching. It is understanding that this is going to hurt, okay, and doing it anyway. And so I'm wondering, do you guys think that courageous aspect is based on the fact that it is, or the fact that we see it as courageous is because we know what it feels like to go into that situation? Craig, I'm going to come to you first. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's true. I've always used the term experiential vocabulary, that the meaning of any given word or concept is local to the individual, and its extent is based on the magnitude to which you've personally experienced that thing. So when one of us thinks about the concept of hunger, the range of hunger, like hunger or full, that we have is dependent on how hungry we've been in the past. So when you see someone throw out words like "I'm starving" or something like that, that means, like most likely that person skipped breakfast and they've been eating steadily for their entire life and they've never actually been that hungry. And the same thing can be said of, like pain, sadness, happiness, joy, whatever. Like the meaning that that word has to you is limited by the extent to which you've experienced it, in a good sense and a bad sense. So, like if you've experienced extreme pain at some point in your life, or extreme sadness or happiness or whatever, then a lot of the other experiences that you have moving forward are going to be moderated, because you have a broader frame of reference that allows you to put those into perspective. And the same thing applies to your ability to take the perspective of others. The greater range of things that you've experienced personally, the more accurately you're likely to be able to perceive the experience of someone else and understand what it's like in their head, as long as you remember that they haven't had the same experiences that you have. So something might be a lot more scary, like say, your kids. Like there are things that don't register to us at all, but that might be terrifying to a young child or really uncomfortable or something like that. And the same thing can apply to an adult who's just had different life experiences, and they perceive it as in a different way than we do. So yes, it's who was it who said that? John Boyd, all knowledge is local knowledge. So any concept only means what it means to us as individuals. And we're just doing our best to try to figure out what the other person means or what they feel.
Interesting. Clay, thoughts at all?
Yeah, I think anytime we talk about like internal processes or experience and perception, we're venturing into the realm of psychology in some sense. So, if fear is based off of the perception of each individual, then the most general direction that you can take is that when the gentleman's picking up the rock, or when someone's doing something that they know could cause them pain, I think what is attractive about it is that they're doing something that's going to be hard and difficult on purpose. And so courage is facing fear willfully. You're facing something that you don't know what the outcome is, you don't know what's going to happen, but you know it's something that you need to do. And so you face that. And for guys on Shaun and Craig's level that are operators in some sense at a high level, their sensitivity to not fear, but their awareness of their fear is a lot greater than someone that has never experienced the things that they have. So if we internalize fear as the perspective of each individual, it's going to be different. It's going to be different to each person. But at the end of the day, what we should all do is have some awareness of our fear and maybe go towards that as our guide and our roadmap. Fear isn't something to get rid of. It's the key or the map to the direction that you probably need to go towards.
I love that, Shaun. What are you thinking?
Well, as Clay was saying that, all I could think of was the little breadcrumbs of fear that take you towards where you're supposed to go, but that'd be an entirely different conversation. Because I want to go back to what Craig said, and he mentioned localized vocabulary or localized understanding of what the word fear means or what courage means or what various things mean to just me in my own unique experience, in my own unique life. I have a different idea of what courage means than the guy down the street, as an example. So we all have this localized understanding. So I do believe that that's true. But something else that bubbled up in my head is that, yeah, there's a localized understanding of courage or fear or various general terms. But then there is a group understanding. And so, first example that popped into my head for whatever reason was the Black Plague in Europe. So, there wasn't a whole pile of newspapers at the time. There was no internet, but there was people dying all around you. And you started forming a pattern and started realizing that, hang on a sec, this Black Plague thing is serious. And now fear starts to become part of the social fabric. Now let's call it COVID. Now let's call it divisive politics. Now let's call it AI. Now let's call it resources. Now let's call it all kinds of things that have now become part of the societal fabric of fear and the societal fabric of courage. So if we look at things like weapons of mass destruction, popped into my head this morning, and as I was considering this, facing the enemy or the courage to face the enemy. And WMD came into my mind, or weapon of mass destruction, because my wife and I just recently watched Oppenheimer just a couple of nights ago. Wow, that's a powerful movie. And, watching the graphic images of the bomb being tested and the entirety of the movie, it puts to scale what a weapon of mass destruction can create. And then, of course, us just having come back from Japan, where it's part of the social fabric, where it's still part of the psyche of the population, that this is a fairly recent thing. It's not so long ago that everyone has shrugged their shoulders and forgotten. So the imprint of fear and courage within the social fabric is also a part of the conversation, on top of, I believe, the localized understanding or the individual's understanding, as Craig said, of what courage means or what the enemy is. And so those two things, I do believe, play against each other and or play off each other, perhaps. But that was a non-issue when the Black Plague was happening, this thing called the internet, or mass distribution of ideas or mass distribution of what courage means to me versus what courage means to someone down the street. And so what the enemy is to me and what enemy is to the guy down the street. So in this ability to rapidly disseminate ideas, it's a lot different than it was 1,000 years ago, obviously. And so there is a certain real-timeness of what courage and fear can mean today versus tomorrow, or versus an hour from now. The news that we don't know that's coming down the pipeline right now, courage and fear will be, I don't want to say manipulated, but will be in flux given who the individual is that's receiving the news and how they receive the news and where the news came from and who's it impacting and all of the things that are currently involved in our social fabric.
That is a heck of a rabbit hole to jump down, and I'm down. Let's go. Let's do it. My thought on that, and I want to get your guys' thoughts as well on the extent of it, is the fact that it's that societal fear, the larger scale fear, is based on how stoic certain figureheads can be within the community. So when I say that, it's like if you're, say, the chief of a village and people are dying of the Black Plague around you, and you start freaking out left, right, and center, and the world is ending, blah, blah, blah. That's not an extent of fear, or that's not an extent of courage. That is you exuding fear. But if you can have all that fear within you and still remain stoic and go, okay, well, there's got to be a solution. There's some sort of reasoning behind this or whatever, and be able to think and process in that moment, then that's going to change how others perceive that fear as well as how they perceive courage in that moment. So I want to get your guys' thoughts on that, but that was just the first thing that popped into my head. Clay, what are you thinking?
Yeah, Shaun is he's taking it deep here. This is going to be so. Immediately, I start thinking about, when he says societal imprints, I start to think Carl Jung's collective consciousness, where the whole society, Japan as an example that Shaun had was, they dealt with something as both significant and remarkable as an atom bomb, and that is imprinted in some way in how they process and handle fear as a society. And then, if I'm following Shaun right, he's kind of suggesting that collective consciousness, going to Craig's term, if it because of the internet, because of how rapid technology puts everything an individual thinks and feels in a broad group, that societal imprint becomes localized. And then how does that come out in the world? How does fear in those moments get used possibly against us? I don't want to go, tinfoil hat. I left it on my armadillo, but that's a really interesting, way to look at it is as the collective consciousness, is being fed with information in the internet. Or Friedrich Nietzsche said that the most difficult psychology to understand is individual psychology. So if collective consciousness essentially starts becoming individual groups and how they're reacting, how does that affect our society at large? And can it be used or manipulated? That's a really, really interesting question, Shaun.
Dang. Craig, thoughts on this?
I don't have a whole lot to contribute to that other than it's definitely a thing. I mean, there's a book called The Madness of Crowds. It's one of the easiest ways to, I think, manipulate people is through like collective emotion, where I know there's another term for this, I can't think of what it is, but individually people tend to be a lot more rational and kind and well behaved than they are in large groups, especially if you can make them panic or motivate them through fear. It's pretty well established through history, I think.
Absolutely. Shaun, thoughts on this?
Yeah, the another thing that popped into my head when we were in Japan is moving through Kyoto and on a busy shopping evening. And I don't mean I was being busy. I mean the entire city seemed like it was entirely downtown. Kyoto, center of Kyoto. It was extremely busy. Lots and lots and lots of people, all interacting, all walking past each other. And for a country that is quite structured and strives towards perfectionism, the crowds in downtown Kyoto, it was a bit chaotic. It wasn't like everyone is on one side and if you're walking this way and everyone's on the other side if you're walking the other way. It was quite intermingled. It was like kind of fish in an aquarium all swimming past each other, but somehow moving well together without bumping into everyone. It just kind of worked in a chaotic, organized pattern. But I will say that from time to time, I'd get shoulder checked, and and shoulder checked not like super duper hard, like vindictively, but like shoulder checked because somehow maybe I hadn't figured out the right pattern to flow through the chaos. And I move pretty well. It's not like I'm a bull in the china shop. I know how to flow. So sometimes when I get checked, I'd like, what? And I'd glance over my shoulder, and the individual who had checked me would be like automatically apologizing, very obviously not confrontational. They would be referencing somehow that they were sorry for what happened, just as I would be as well. And so that's Japan. But I've been to other countries where if you get shoulder checked, someone's going to look over the shoulder and give you the hard stink eye. So culturally, in one country versus another country, if we're talking about a societal fabric, then it's not just the term, well, society as a whole can drive individual actions that then feedback loop into the social fabric. And it's this wicked sort of loop of just building itself up into a frenzy. I'm not suggesting that that is universally applicable to every single nation, because nations are different or countries are different from country to country. And so what I do see, though, making a contextual observation between North America versus, well, Australia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Japan were the last 4 countries I was in, quite a bit different over there. In fact, when you're over there, it's an entirely different planet. The concerns of the day are not the concerns over here. The hot topics that everyone tunes into immediately as soon as they get up in the morning to see how the world is going have no relevance on this other part of the planet called the rest of the world. And so when you're in these different, when, we're halfway around the planet, on that part of the world, the concerns over there are not the concerns over here. And so that social fabric over there is quite a bit different than the social fabric over here. So the iterative frenzy loop that can occur, that is occurring over in North America, more so than halfway around the planet, where there's less problems because the feedback loop isn't in a frenzy state like it is over here. So that's an observation for sure.
Interesting. I wrote down here while you were talking, Shaun, the instinctual herd mentality. And I got the picture of, I'm not sure why this is in my head, but we went to Head Smash and Buffalo Jump earlier this summer. And for those who don't know what that is, it is a, it's a cliff face that the indigenous would run buffalo off the edge of the cliff face. And there was a whole setup and how they did it and so on and so forth. But what they tried to do in order to make it work is to create the instinctual herd mentality. So when they scare, as they funnel all of the buffalo into this area, they would then scare the rear. And as soon as the rear got scared, that would travel all the way to the front and it would create a stampede and they would all run off the edge of the cliff. So it's a very interesting sequence, but I'm not going to get into that one. But I wonder how much the society itself and the those hot topics, those things that were constantly in these states of frenzy, like at the things you mentioned right off the bat, like divisive politics and AI and all these things that we you had written down earlier, those all create that same kind of mentality, right? But if you were to take one buffalo and one wolf out in the field, they would almost regulate each other, right? They'd always kind of keep an eye on each other. One wouldn't really affect the other, but in a group state on one side or the other, things change. So if you have all the buffalo and one wolf, well, that wolf's going to get driven off. But if you have all of the wolves and one buffalo, things are going to be different, right? So I'm wondering how much mammalian instinctual herd mentality we have as, basically smarter monkeys without realizing that we're falling back into that state when we have these fear topics driven into us. What are you guys' thoughts on that? Clay, coming to you first. What do you think?
Yeah, I get some kind of questions like that a lot, especially at the substance abuse clinic, where there's a lot of the, we're just animals, and sometimes that is really just a reason to do things that they know that they shouldn't. But I think if we could simplify, as creatures, animals, we have as humans, what's kind of special about us, I would assume, is what they call higher order moral principles. And that's a concept like Robert Wright in The Social Animal or The Moral Animal. He kind of brought up that we have these higher order moral principles. So when I think about what Shaun's saying and kind of what Craig was saying, like it's pretty much known throughout history that, one part of the herd can affect the other, it really makes me think about what does each society have that's different, and what do they have that's the same. And Eastern countries, they're widely viewed as collectivistic. They have different beliefs and values, and Western countries were more individualistic by definition. So then you think, the reaction to fear would then be based off of what does each society value or believe in. And that's different between a collectivistic and an individualistic society. So then the reaction would be different. It's gonna be different based off the beliefs and values. And I think what's cool about that is you can really kind of put that under a magnifying glass to the individual, because based off of what you believe and value is how you're going to react under a fear state, whether it's something that you're getting off the internet, or it's an experience that you've had. The underlying substrate to what fear does for you or to you is based off of what you believe in and what you value. And those are kind of important things to identify, because fear as a motivator is not sustainable. It will motivate you, but if it motivates you, it's probably going to lead it will lead you to choose the easier path if it's fear-based, in my opinion.
It'll lead you off the cliff, 100%. Craig, what are you thinking?
I was interested in what Shaun was saying about being in a place where people's day-to-day worries are completely different than the things that like we in North America will fixate on. Like I spend a fair amount of time in Costa Rica, like a little surf town, and I always notice when I'm there that I have zero urge to look at my phone. Like I don't care what's going on really anywhere else, and I don't need like dumb external stimulation, because there's so much else to engage with there. There's like surfing and mountain biking, and like it's just a beautiful place to be. And you don't notice that when you're in like North America. Like if I'm home in Colorado and I have 30 seconds of boredom and I want to like look at my phone or go do something else or distract myself or engage in something that I like, worry about something that I cannot have any effect on whatsoever, I get caught up in that. But a change of location and change of like climate and culture influences that like underlying preoccupation and where I go with my thoughts and actions. I find that really interesting. And I was curious what you learned from that, Shaun, or what was noticeable and what people were preoccupied by in other places that are different from what we worry about here. What
Shaun,
you observed.
what do you think?
Well, I think that I'm with Craig on that, having been to Costa Rica a couple of times or other countries like it. When you drop into a place where, and I think this will maybe answer the second part as to what I learned over in Malaysia, Singapore, Japan, and Australia. When you get to different countries, these countries have different fears, different issues, different individual issues, different societal issues, different political issues, different, all the difference. It's just different. It's a different country with a different way of life. It's like a different little planet within the planet. And so maybe the biggest issue, the biggest fear in that country is poverty, like being able to eat a nutritious meal that day. So in parts of Costa Rica, of course, it's a fairly affluent country in that region of the world. But that doesn't mean that there's affluence throughout the entire country. You get out into the rural areas and it's beans and rice and maybe a bit of chicken, pollo. And so that level of poverty can then turn the day's focus into where's the next meal rather than who's running for president. And so these things that have no bearing on just the day-to-day get-bys, the day-to-day survives, the day-to-day just get another meal, the day-to-day get the kids to school. Like when the world compresses down into, we'll call it just surviving, all of the extraneous stuff, all of the stuff on the periphery about what color tie was that guy wearing on that particular political stage, none of those things matter, because you're just wondering where the next beans and rice are going to come from. So the priorities are shifted in some of these countries. I'm thinking of Malaysia as an example, where it's not particularly affluent, and unless you're in Kuala Lumpur. And so you get out into some of these more typical cities where there is poverty visible. And the focus there is on living a good daily life rather than who's going to be doing what next year on the political stage, or who's going to be dotting 3 years from now. Those things are not a concern. What is a concern is getting the kids to school in a freshly pressed school uniform, while then getting onto your job or your second job or whatever the case is, to then pick up the kids from school and then feed the family, wash and repeat, and I'm going to say it, and somehow be happy. And that somehow part is probably going to make people think, well, somehow what's wrong with that life? There's nothing wrong with that life. It's a great life. Where it somehow goes wrong is people want more, get greedy, and then start forgetting about the central importance of, if all you do is raise kids well, put a roof over their head, feed them, and then try to live a good life, well, that's 100% life. That's a 10 out of 10. But if you get greedy and you want to now you want to build a 47-story skyscraper in your backyard, or you want to learn how to be a falcon master, all of these distractions that take you away from the central importance of get a roof over your head, live a good life, raise good kids. If that's all you ever do, well, 10 out of 10. But the moment that you start seeking how to be a falcon master, but start ignoring the central themes within your life, which is to make sure that your kids have got clean socks on, well, that's kind of what I see happen a little bit in North America. The distractions away from the central importances of life, and I'm not sure why the distractions are occurring, can't get the kids to school on time because too focused on whatever thing that is the distraction. That isn't the case over in Asia as I saw it. I'm seeing some kids on a subway train in Kyoto, about 6 years old, in perfectly pressed school uniforms late in the evening, coming back from school by themselves. And I mean, they were just above hip high. They were little kids, perfectly squared away, knew exactly what they were doing, capable of moving around a metropolis like nearly 4 million people. These kids, this wasn't their first rodeo. They looked like seasoned pros. They were more squared away as 6 and 7-year-olds than most adults I see trying to fumble their way around North America on a bus. And so how is it that kids at that age can be more capable than someone over here who is distracted by what the Wall Street Journal is saying today and tomorrow and the next day? I think that life over there as an observation seems to me to be a little more dialed in as to the importances of life rather than over here, which are the distractions of life.
That is fantastic. I have a thought on that, but I want to get you guys' opinions first. Clay, what are you thinking?
No, I love it. It took me back to kind of a memory I had where, we were in Afghanistan and doing all the things that light infantry does, just kind of walking around. We had our mission or whatever, but I remember seeing these two little kids, and they were like kneeled down by this small little hill, and they had these marbles that they were like putting in their thumbs like this and launching like little mini catapults. But the game was to toss the marble, and as it rolled down the hill, at the bottom of the hill, they grooved these like small little holes, like little, almost like a contact lens, but in the ground. So if you got the marble to sit in the first one, it was more points than the other two, and we were like trying to play with them, figure out like what they were doing. But afterwards, sometime later, it made me realize, I was like, those kids are, you look around, they're in this war-torn country with no electricity, and they're finding happiness, kind of like Shaun was saying. Like you will feel the sensation of happiness regardless of the situation in some way or another. And to me, that was kind of a pivotal moment, because then I thought back to like what my own kids were probably doing, which was probably fighting over the Xbox controller. And so it really puts into perspective, that external things will never feel an internal void. And if that, I think, is the distractions that we have here, is we oftentimes in this consumerist mindset think that some external thing is going to fill some internal void, and it's just not so. And I think that's a concept that, as far as using Shaun's term, as a societal fabric, we have wove this consumer mindset so deep that it's hard to see outside of it. And I don't mean just buying things. I mean, just that something new is going to be the answer. It could be a new boyfriend, it could be a new girlfriend, it could be, I'm going to consume more knowledge than the other person, even to that extent. So yeah, it's an interesting thing to contemplate, of how, I've said it once and I'll say it again. I do believe that the more comfortable a society gets, the more mental health issues it's going to have.
Yeah, absolutely. Craig, thoughts on this?
I think they actually observed that in the UK during World War II, when they were under bombardment by the Germans. Um, that external stressor and like mortal issue had a way of focusing people on things that mattered, and that it actually like reduced a lot of like otherwise present mental health issues that people had, because they had like more pressing problems to deal with and things that brought them together as a community and allowed them to like gave them something to actively cope with. Like you guys have probably all experienced this. Like there are times when you really miss the simplicity of deployment, like being overseas, living in a tent somewhere with a really like you're either doing your job or you're not. And then if you're not doing your job, you have your triangle of life, which is like gym, food, showers. Like there's not a lot else you can do. And there were times when like that was like the most at peace and happy I was. Like you miss some of those moments because it allows you to have like clarity and kind of clean switches between the things that you're doing, and there's not an unlimited amount of nonsense to distract you. Like most of that time I didn't have a working phone. Like we're in the middle of nowhere, there's not a lot of choice in what you're eating. You just kind of you find happiness in smaller things. And there's some research on like Dan Gilbert's book Stumbling on Happiness looks at this, and basically will habituate to any source of material happiness within about 3 months. Typically, if we buy a new car, get a new house, whatever, it's awesome for a while, and then we level set, and now it's normal, and we need something new to make us happy again, and we go on that hedonic treadmill. And we'll chase that forever unless we shift more toward experiences, like things that you can't buy, but things that you do to some extent. Like you do need some money to buy a plane ticket or things like that, but you generally can't purchase happiness unless it comes in the form of an experience, at least not in the long term. I had some friends over, like you can see, I live in the mountains in Colorado, so bears, mountain lions, things like that are a pretty present thing. And he was talking about like he was on a hike with his girlfriend, and they came up on a mountain lion that was somewhere fairly close to them, and he could like feel its presence watching him, this predator. And he talked about how like like awake and alert it made him, and how like hyper focused he was in that moment. And I think that's actually something that we don't have enough of in our world, because neurologically there's a distinction between fear and anxiety. Um, Anxiety is if you're a mouse and you're in a room and you smell a cat. It's a premonition of a potential threat somewhere in the future, but it's not the active presence of that threat. Where fear is you're a mouse and there's a cat and it's trying to chase you or it's trying to kill you. So fear is actively dealing with a present moment threat. And a lot of us, especially like North American or Western cultures, we have plenty of anxiety. We have very little true fear. And we've been talking about facing the enemy and courage and fear. And the truth is, like, I think most people very rarely experience fear. It's so lacking in our lives that we do it recreationally by putting ourselves on roller coasters, or like doing things where like fear is externally imposed by a controlled source because it's the only way we can find it. And I think without that, periodically in our lives we lose sight of the things that actually matter, and we get lost in our anxieties that are just imaginations, or our imagined problems from the future. And those can spin up into any kind of ghosts that we want without being real, and they can become terrible distractions.
I think you're dead on there. That was my thoughts exactly. I wrote down when Shaun was first talking was courage in the now. And I think that is the key point of this, is that courage only takes place in the now. You can't be courageous in 20 minutes, right? Like you have to have a threat happening right now for us to be courageous. And I think that is the key, because if you're not in those moments, I was thinking in terms of, combat, right? If you're going to be courageous when you're leaving on a patrol in 20 minutes, those guys are all like, yeah, let's go get some. Whoa! Those guys aren't courageous. They're scared out of their mind, right? But the people that are courageous in those moments are stoic, are, okay, where's my gear? Let's get this set up. Let's go do this. Blah, blah, blah. They're getting prepared. They're ready for it. So that when that thing happens that exposes them to true fear, then they can fall back on that courage that they've already preset. So I think that's something to that point, at least, and to Shaun's point about the different cultures setting that up, is that's what the parents are doing, right? They're living in the now. They're taking courage in the now. I have to feed my kids, therefore I have to go and what was the lady do selling the fish sticks or the things on the side of the road? Sugar cane in Malacca, right? That's her every day for 50 plus years. And that takes courage to wake up every day to know that that's what you're doing in order to feed your kids. So that
I disagree.
You disagree?
I disagree in the sense of using the term courage in that sense. I mean, she squeezed sugarcane juice for 50 years. That at some point, that wasn't courage. That was just routine. That was just her getting right with the idea that for the next, she probably didn't think it was going to be 50 years. I'm going to be squeezing sugarcane every day. And so that's less courage. That's just accepting your fate in life, as it were. Courage to me is the unknown, when that pops around the corner, like the mountain cat. And so I have a good example of that. My wife and I were out in the middle of nowhere in the mountains, and I was just a few steps ahead of my wife, who was pregnant. And this biggest mountain cat I've ever seen in my life, big male, bounded directly across in front of me, about, I don't know, whatever, 15 feet or 20 feet in front of me. And right away, straight into a fighting stance, pulled out my little folder and started backing off, giving my wife all the hand signals that she totally didn't understand, because of course she wasn't in special operations. So quickly explained that there's a big ass mountain, or a big old mountain cat, and he's right there. And that guy hunted us for quite a while. We actually had to move into a tactical bound situation. So I'd get my wife to move one tactical bound ahead of me and hold up there. And I'd be watching what that cat was doing the whole time. And then I'd bound up to her. So we had to bound our way out of the national park, or out of the park that we were in. It chased us, hunted us on the parallel up on the high ground, always visible to me. It hunted us for quite a while. I want to say well over half an hour anyway. And so that moment, I wasn't being courageous. My wife wasn't being courageous. What we were was dealing with the moment based on a whole boatload of experiences from our pasts. And so my idea of courage and the lady who's doing sugarcane juice and you guys' idea of courage, as Craig has already said, is contextual based on our localized understanding of what courage means. But I think courage requires fear, and fear isn't doing your job every day. Fear is when something jumps out in front of you and makes you a little, gives you a response, a reaction, a fearful moment, we'll call it. And so you can create fear in your life. So it doesn't require combat, it doesn't require a mountain cat. You can create the unknown. You can adventure into the void, just as we did in Asia. Every freaking day was an adventure. It's not that we were hustling so hard to see all the shrines and all the museums and all of the castles and all of the things, but we saw a lot. And to put all of that together kind of on the fly each day, it required a lot of moving pieces. It required a lot of buses, a lot of subways, a lot of trains, a lot of walking, a lot of looking at our watches to try and meet timing, and getting down into the subways and losing Google Maps and looking at all of the exits or entrances and thinking, okay, let's go for that. And so some adventuring, not old-timey adventuring, modern adventuring, where there aren't pirates and swashbucklers. It's just other people. And so in those adventurous travels, you're facing certain small fears of the unknown, of missing something or of going the wrong direction or whatever the case is. Stepping into an adventure in a new country, to me, is dipping your toe into the swimming pool called courage. And so if your idea of life is back and forth from work to home and work to home and work to home for the rest of your life, and then once a year you go to the shopping mall, which is half an hour away, and that's the big adventure for the year, you're not going to be exposed to anything abnormal, which is not going to create any fear, which is not going to create any sense of what courage can be for you in that moment. Now, courage, if you go to that shopping mall and your kid runs off to see the latest stuffed bunny, and then you get separated, now you don't know where your kid is. Now there's some fear, a moment of panic, maybe, where you don't know where your kid is. You don't know how you're going to get together again. You're not sure what's going to happen next. That requires courage in that moment. But that is rare in North America, courage, because of the fears that most people are being inundated with are happening right in their homes. The fears that they're facing are rarely out there on the street. It's mostly in their social media, or it's mostly in their news that they're watching, or it's mostly in the newspaper that they read. All of the fears before they even leave their house have already been happening. And how to be courageous in those moments against all of those external forces that are entering digitally into your home, well, that's a difficult proposition. If your idea of being courageous is pumping your fist at the clouds because yet another news bite didn't agree with you, well, that's a false sense of fear and a false sense of courage. And so to understand courage, to understand fear, you got to go out into the big bad world and enter into the adventurous spirit of some curiosity in maybe not a foreign land, but certainly in a foreign city where you're facing the unknown. I think society could gain a lot from a little bit of travel.
Absolutely. Clay, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's not every day you get, two tier one guys kind of on in the same podcast. So I'm going to steal your job a little bit, Chance, because kind of going back to the early question, and I'm curious about this, of in that peak exhaustive moment, and to find, if I'm the everyday person, how do I do what Shaun's suggesting, where so my example would be, we'll take David Goggins, right? David Goggins, to me, he's a living, breathing human being, but he's like an archetype of what people want to do for themselves but can't, which is create those small pieces of adversity or unknown on a daily basis. And for most people, that's really hard. Like, it's really hard to do that. To me, that I could equate that to, why does a person in peak exhaustion choose to keep going and some don't? And I think that's why it's so important. People like Shaun, people like Seb are gaining voice and traction in the world, because I really do think that, to Craig's point, that we need more of that in our lives. But the problem is there, cross our fingers, but there is not going to be another World War III. That's not a choice. So now, with the way that society is, things are so easy. We're going to have a society of people who choose adversity. I don't know how that happens, or I'm curious to see what you guys think about how can we help? How can we give action items, I guess, to the everyday person on how to choose small pieces of adversity? Like, to me, the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu match is that every time I go in there, I don't know, this blue belt might take me out. It's every single time. To me, that would be an obvious answer. But I'm just curious, back to the peak exhaustion thing, what are some things that you guys did that helped you create a habit of building those small adversities in your life to overcome, I guess, if that makes sense?
You're hired. You can take the job. It's all yours. Craig, what are you thinking?
Um, I put myself in a place where I didn't have a choice. That was my solution to that. I was, like I was conscious of the need to develop those things through experience, like reading about strength or courage or whatever, knowing all the words for it doesn't mean anything if you haven't lived it, like learned it through living it. So I just joined the Navy without knowing how to swim and put myself through that. I agree. I think this is something that our society needs and that people are actively looking for. And there's a strong danger that if the smart people don't speak out and try to help people find this, that the dumb people are going to take over and send a lot of people down the wrong path. Like, there's a lot of sort of like social media influencer Pied Pipers who are probably not good for the world, that are talking to these markets, to these people. I think culturally, like almost everything, the answer can be found in Fight Club, and we need more Raymond K. Hessels, like people who just decide that whatever it is that you want to do, you're either going to do that or you're going to die. Like you need desperation. Like, Shaun, were you reading the Hagakure recently? I think I saw it in your Instagram. The Hagakure, they have this idea, the samurai had this idea that courage is desperation. Courage is just akin to desperation. Um, and I think, like, so you think of a mother lifting a car off her child, fighting a bear or whatever. I think a lot of us don't have desperation. We're comfortable enough that nothing really matters. And there's nothing that's going to push us through adversity because there's nothing on the other side that we really care about. So I think people need to find a way to put themselves in a situation where, like, they have to suffer for the thing that they want. Like, that was the original meaning of the word passion, was to suffer and endure. It used to be that what you were passionate about was something for which you're willing to suffer. And I think we've kind of lost that. Not a lot of us have things that we're willing to suffer for. And that's where we need to look, probably.
That's a great point. Shaun, any points to add to this?
Well, as Craig was saying, suffering, the key word, I think that a lot of people live quiet lives of desperation, quiet lives of suffering, but they're not desperate enough to get out of their quiet life of desperation. They're not willing to suffer enough to get out of their quiet life of suffering. So it's almost a disconnect between living the life that they don't want to, but not able to understand that if they just do rather than think, the doing part will sort it all out. And so be desperate enough to get out of your quiet life of desperation. Suffer a bit more just to get out of your quiet life of suffering. And so, what does desperate and suffering mean? Well, I think a great way to approach this, and you can approach it at the velocity that you want and as deeply as you care to, is just freaking tie on a white belt in anything, anything, anything. You've never done macrame before? Tie on a white belt of macrame. Because if you're really suffering, if you're really desperate to find a way out of your quiet life of desperation and suffering, well, taking on a new thing will start putting you in a new place. And as you're trying to learn how to do macrame, which I've never really done, if you're doing that, well, I bet you're going to be freaking frustrated as you learn how to do it. Because one of the things about being desperate and suffering in silence is things that will irk you a lot, will bug you a lot. And it's that being bugged that you need. You need to like be bugged for a while by the macrame. You've got to be irritated by the process that you're stepping into in order to learn how to move through the process. You've got to earn the macrame. You can't just do it for a day. You got to do it for long enough that it's going to like probably irritate you at about week 3. Why did I even start this stupid macrame stuff? When you're at that point, now you know you're onto a good thing. You're in a new adventure, something that you're not sure where it's going to take you. You're being challenged by the monotony of it, perhaps. But if you just keep forging through it, you're going to face the things that you need to face to get you to a better position than where you are right now. So again, quiet life of desperation, quiet life of suffering, tie on a white belt in anything, and you'll start improving.
Yeah, absolutely. Now we are over time now. I really, really appreciate the conversation. Clay, Craig, Shaun, this has been fantastic. I've been so engrossed in the conversation, I haven't taken any timestamps, so I'm gonna have to watch this again because that was just fantastic. I really appreciate it. Any final thoughts? Anything at all that's still bubbling in the back of your brain? I imagine there's quite a few, but let's do one. Clay, how about yourself?
Yeah, I'll be short and simple. And I keep sending you t-shirts ideas, Chance. If we don't get a I vibe through life with Shaun in the background and some kind of silhouette, then I'm never watching again. Just kidding.
Raj, I'll make it happen.
Yeah. So the really short and brief is choose courage. And if you listen to this podcast, you'll know that courage is fear, it is suffering, it is all of those things. So when you say choose courage, it's not this like flowers and roses thing. It's if you listen to these guys, they're basically saying choose courage. It's choose fear, choose suffering, choose to do the hard things. So choose courage.
Bam. I like it. Craig, final thoughts?
I honestly don't really have a lot more to add. I think choose the hard things or choose the hard way is probably a good way to go, or a good way to summarize that. So I'm just going to steal that.
I like it. Shaun, thoughts?
And I'll keep it brief as well. Courage in the face of the enemy. Know who the enemy is, and it probably isn't the guy halfway around the planet. It's probably you. So face yourself and deal with the things that are bugging you internally. Show a bit of courage to get to work on the thing that is you. And I think that in pretty short order, you'll find that you'll be able to apply more courage externally once you've faced your internal issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't have much to add other than the fact that there's a quote that I really love from Marcus Aurelius, and I couldn't tell you the quote off the top of my head, but the shortened version of it is, the obstacle is the way. So if you're afraid of something, guess what you got to do? Head towards that fear and start working on it, because that's going to lead you into where you're supposed to be. So that means learn something new. That means build upon that knowledge and grow into the person that you're meant to be. And you can do that with us here on The Collective. We'll see you tomorrow. Chimo.
Chimo.